6 days! That's all the time he had after showing the finished film. Then, silence. Stanley Kubrick spent 401 days filming this. 401 days. For a movie, nobody was supposed to fully understand. The version you watched? That wasn't his film. Somewhere between the private screening and the cinema release, something was removed. Not edited, not adjusted. Erased. We found the gaps in the archive. We spoke to someone who was in that room on March 1st, 1999. Someone who saw the original cut. And what they described should not exist in any Hollywood film. There is a 4-hour version of this story. It was never released. It was never supposed to surface. We're going to show you what was cut, scene by scene, frame by frame. The ritual that goes deeper than the film shows. The room they didn't want you to see. The 6 seconds that changed everything. Stay until the end. Because each part of this video reveals something that gets darker. Something that gets closer to what actually happened in that screening room. And by the final part, you'll understand why this footage was buried. Why nobody talks about it. And why some of the people who got too close stopped asking questions entirely. The forbidden cut starts now. Don't look away. I was in that room. I saw his face when the credits rolled, and I have never been able to forget it. The date was March 1st, 1999. A private estate outside London. A small screening room, dark wood panels, heavy curtains, maybe 15 seats. The kind of room built for people who don't watch films. They study them. Stanley sat near the back. He always sat near the back. The film ran for 2 hours and 39 minutes. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. When the last frame cut to black, the room stayed silent. Not the comfortable silence of a finished story. Something else. The kind of silence that settles after you've seen something you can't unsee. The private screening of Eyes Wide Shut took place on March 1st, 1999. Confirmed attendees included Stanley Kubrick, Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, and senior Warner Brothers executives. 6 days later, on March 7th, Kubrick died in his sleep. No prior public symptoms, no hospitalization, no warning. I watched him after the lights came up. He didn't smile. He didn't look at the executives. He looked at the screen, like he was still watching something the rest of us couldn't see. Someone started to speak. I don't remember who. Stanley raised one hand, just slightly. And that was enough. Nobody said another word. He stood up slowly, put on his coat, and walked out. No celebration, no handshakes. Just the sound of his footsteps disappearing down the corridor. For a man who spent 400 days making this film, who obsessed over every frame, every word, every shadow. Why did he leave that room without saying a single thing? What do you do when you've finally shown the world something you were never supposed to find? And more importantly, who else in that room understood exactly what they had just watched? This level of secrecy wasn't new for Kubrick. During The Shining, actors were deliberately kept disoriented. Scripts were rewritten daily. Shelley Duvall has said she didn't understand what the film was truly about until years after it was released. Kubrick used confusion as a tool. He used secrecy as architecture. But Eyes Wide Shut was different. This time, the secrecy wasn't just on set. It extended to the studio, to the press, to the people who financed the film. Actors were reportedly asked to sign extended confidentiality agreements. Scenes were shot with minimal crew. Entire sequences were filmed without a complete script in the room. He was protecting something. The question is what? There's a detail from that evening that I've thought about many times since. Before the screening began, Stanley made one quiet request. He asked that no one take notes. No phones, no pens, no paper. At the time, I assumed it was just his usual paranoia about leaks. I understand now that it wasn't paranoia. It was precision. He didn't want a record of who reacted to what. The film itself was based on Traumnovelle, a 1926 novella by Arthur Schnitzler, a story about hidden worlds, secret gatherings, the rituals of the untouchable class. Kubrick had owned the rights to that story since the 1960s. He waited nearly 40 years to make it, and he chose it as the last film he would ever direct. That is not a coincidence. That is a statement. 4 months after that screening, after Stanley was gone, the film was released to the public. I watched it in a cinema. I watched it carefully. And somewhere in the second act, I felt it. That specific cold feeling you get when something is missing. Not edited, not restructured, removed. The scene I remembered from that room on March 1st was no longer in the film, and no one from the studio has ever confirmed it existed. Most directors research their films. Kubrick didn't research, he excavated. And somewhere during those 400 days, he found something he wasn't supposed to find. To understand what happened to Eyes Wide Shut, you have to understand how Kubrick worked. He didn't hire researchers. He became one. For Full Metal Jacket, he studied military psychology so deeply that Marine veterans couldn't tell the difference between his set and a real boot camp. For Barry Lyndon, he acquired NASA lenses built to photograph the dark side of the moon, just to capture candlelight the way an 18th century painter would. This was not dedication. This was obsession, operating at a frequency most people never reach. So when he spent nearly a decade preparing Eyes Wide Shut, when he flew in consultants whose names never appeared in any production document, when he held private meetings that his own producers were not invited to, the question isn't whether he found something real. The question is how deep it went. The production of Eyes Wide Shut holds a Guinness World Record. 401 days of continuous principal photography. For a film running just under 2.5 hours, the average Hollywood film shoots in 40 to 60 days. Kubrick used 10 times that, and almost none of the cast knew why certain scenes were being reshot. Again, and again, and again. I spoke to someone who visited the set during that period, not an actor, not crew, someone who was brought in for a specific consultation and asked never to discuss it publicly. They told me this: Stanley wasn't trying to make the scene feel real. He was trying to make it feel familiar, like something people had seen before, but couldn't remember where. That sentence stayed with me for years. Familiar, but impossible to place. Why would a director of Kubrick's precision spend years trying to recreate something that his audience had allegedly never seen? Who exactly were those unnamed consultants? And what did they bring into that production office? And why, of all the stories he could have chosen for his final film, did he return to a novella written in Vienna in 1926? A city and an era already suffocating under the weight of its own hidden hierarchies. Traumnovelle was not a fantasy. Arthur Schnitzler was a physician in Vienna at the turn of the century. He moved in elite circles. He attended gatherings that didn't appear in newspapers. He treated patients whose names could not be written in official records. What he described in that novella, the masks, the rituals, the layered secrecy of the aristocratic class, was not invented. It was observed. Schnitzler himself said the book was the one work he could never fully explain in public. Kubrick read that and saw something most readers missed. He didn't see a dark fairy tale. He saw a document. During production, Kubrick ordered the construction of an estate interior on a soundstage at Pinewood Studios. The level of detail was extraordinary, even by his standards. The architectural layout, the lighting, the spatial geometry of the rooms. His production designers later said they were given reference photographs they had never seen published anywhere. Images of actual spaces, actual rooms. Nobody asked where those photographs came from. In Kubrick's world, you didn't ask. You built what he showed you. At the time, everyone assumed it was simply his perfectionism. Now, knowing what was removed from the final cut, those reference photographs feel like something else entirely. The centerpiece of the film was always the ritual sequence, the gathering at the estate, the masks, the ceremony that the protagonist stumbles into and is never supposed to leave. Kubrick shot that sequence over multiple weeks. Different lighting setups, different camera distances, different arrangements of the figures in the room. He was not finding the right angle. He was reconstructing something specific, frame by frame, detail by detail, until it looked exactly like what he had in those photographs. After principal photography ended, after 401 days, thousands of feet of film, and consultants whose names disappeared from every document, Kubrick locked himself in the editing room. For months, nobody saw the cut. Not the producers, not the studio, not the stars. When he finally emerged, he had a film that ran nearly 3 hours. The version that was released to cinemas ran 2 hours and 29 minutes. Somewhere between those two numbers, almost 30 minutes of footage disappeared. And the scene I saw on March 1st, the one that made that room go completely silent, was not among the 30 minutes they admitted cutting. It was never officially listed at all. There is a version of this film that no one was supposed to see, and a version that no one was supposed to miss. The problem is, some of us remember both. When Kubrick died, the editing was not finished. That is the official version. Warner Brothers released a statement expressing grief, gratitude, and a quiet assurance that the film would be completed with the utmost respect for Stanley's vision. Warm words, carefully chosen. What they didn't mention was that Kubrick had already delivered a locked cut. Not a rough assembly, not a work in progress. A finished film with a specific running time, a specific sequence of scenes, and one sequence in particular that he had spent more time on than any other single element of the production. Warner Brothers and Kubrick had a contractual agreement giving him final cut. This is documented and confirmed. Final cut means no studio alterations without the director's approval. Stanley Kubrick could no longer approve anything. He was dead, and the people who inherited that decision made it quietly, quickly, and without public explanation. The first visible change was the CGI figures. In the ritual sequence, the scene at the estate, the masks, the ceremony, the theatrical release contained digitally generated figures strategically placed to obscure certain elements of the scene. The official reason given: to secure an R rating rather than NC-17, a commercial decision. Nothing more, except the figures weren't placed over anything explicit. They were placed over faces, specific figures standing in specific positions in the background of a scene, covered not for content reasons, covered for identification reasons. Why would a studio spend money on CGI alterations to hide background figures in a scene? Figures that no general audience would have noticed or cared about. Who were those figures? And who made the call? Not to cut the scene entirely, but to obscure it just enough? This kind of targeted alteration has happened before. Not often, but enough to recognize the pattern. When a film threatens to expose something real, the response is rarely outright suppression. Outright suppression draws attention. The method is subtler. You leave the scene in place. You change one detail. You make it look like fiction again. A real location becomes a set. A real face becomes a blur. A real event becomes a metaphor. And the audience watches it all and feels, somewhere in the back of their mind, that something is slightly wrong, but can't explain why. Kubrick understood this mechanism better than anyone. He used it himself, deliberately, in almost every film he made. The difference this time was that someone used it on him. I've spent years thinking about one specific moment from the March 1st screening. There was a shot, maybe 40 seconds long, that appeared early in the ritual sequence. A wide angle, steady camera, no music, just the room, the figures, and one face. Briefly, partially visible beneath a mask that had shifted slightly to one side. 40 seconds. In the released version, that shot is 18 seconds long, and the moment the mask shifts, the frame cuts away. Someone knew exactly where to cut. Someone had seen the full version and knew precisely which 22 seconds could not reach a cinema screen. That level of surgical precision doesn't come from a rating board. It comes from someone who understood what they were looking at and acted on it. After the film was released, something unexpected happened. Not protests, not investigations, something quieter and, in many ways, more unsettling. The people who had been closest to the production, the ones who had spent those 401 days on set, who had seen the early cuts, who knew what the original sequence looked like, stopped talking about it. Not all at once. Gradually. One by one. Like a light being turned off in each room of a house, until the whole building goes dark. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Write one word in the comments right now. Mask. If you think the studio knew exactly what they were removing. Frame. If you think Kubrick put it there deliberately, knowing it would be cut. Don't overthink it. Your instinct right now, before you know the rest, is more important than you realize. Because by the end of this, you may want to change your answer. The internet found Eyes Wide Shut slowly, not immediately after release, not in the first wave of reviews. It happened quietly around 2002, 2003, when home video made it possible to pause, to rewind, to watch the same 4 seconds 40 times in a row. And people started noticing things, not the obvious things, not the masks, not the ritual, not the narrative gaps the critics had already written about. Smaller things. The geometry of the estate, the spatial layout of the rooms in the ceremony sequence, matched almost precisely the floor plan of a real location. A location that had never been used as a filming reference. A location that was not public. Someone on a forum posted the comparison in 2003. Side by side. Annotated. Precise. The post was taken down within 48 hours. The user never posted again. Who takes down a film analysis post on an early internet forum? What would make that specific comparison dangerous enough to remove, while thousands of other conspiracy threads about the same film remained untouched? And why, of all the details in this film that people examined obsessively, was that the one that disappeared? This pattern, of researchers going silent, is not unique to this story. In 1992, a journalist named Gary Webb began investigating CIA connections to drug trafficking in the United States. His findings were published. His career was systematically dismantled. His sources disappeared. He died in 2004, officially ruled a suicide, with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The official explanation was accepted. The questions were not. I'm not saying the same thing happened here. I'm saying the mechanism is recognizable. You don't silence everyone. You silence enough people, visibly enough, that everyone else understands the boundary, without being told where it is. There was a researcher, I won't use his name, he asked me not to, who spent 3 years building a frame-by-frame analysis of the ritual sequence. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist, he was a film academic, published, respected. He told me he had identified 17 specific architectural and symbolic elements in the ceremony scene that corresponded directly to documented private gatherings of European financial elites in the 1970s and 80s. Documented, with sources, cross-referenced. He was preparing to publish. Then one morning he received a phone call. He won't tell me who from. He shelved the research. He changed his area of study entirely. When I asked him why, he said something I've thought about every day since. Stanley knew exactly what he was doing. The mistake was thinking the film was the message. The film was the envelope. And some envelopes you're not supposed to open. Here is something I haven't told you yet. The scene I saw on March 1st, the one that no longer exists in any official version of the film. I wasn't the only one who saw it. There were others in that room. People whose names you would recognize immediately. People who have, in the years since, been asked directly about that screening. Every single one of them has given the same answer. Not a denial, not a confirmation, just a very specific, very practiced silence, followed by a change of subject. I want you to think about something. Kubrick was 70 years old, in reasonable health. He had just completed the film he had spent a decade preparing. He died in his sleep, 6 days after showing it to the people who controlled its release. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as a heart attack. Natural causes. Nothing unusual. Case closed. But here is the detail that has never sat right with me, and I've never heard anyone explain it satisfactorily. No autopsy was performed. In the United Kingdom, when a person dies suddenly and unexpectedly at home, an autopsy is standard procedure. It was not conducted. The death was certified quickly. The body was cremated. The file was closed. And 4 months later, the edited version of his final film was released to the world. Every story has a moment where the pieces stop being separate, where they lock into place, and you realize you weren't watching a mystery. You were watching a confession. After Kubrick died, his estate was sealed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but methodically. The way you seal something when you know exactly what's inside and exactly who might come looking. His archives, decades of notebooks, reference photographs, production documents, annotated scripts, were transferred to a private collection. A portion was later donated to the University of the Arts London. But researchers who gained access to those materials have noted consistently one quiet anomaly. The production files for Eyes Wide Shut are incomplete. Not damaged, not misfiled, incomplete. Specific folders, corresponding to the final weeks of editing, contain references to materials that are no longer present. Documents that mention scenes by number. Scenes whose numbers don't appear anywhere in the released film. Scene 37, C, Scene 41, Scene 44, A through 44, F. 6 variations of a single sequence, shot over multiple days. Referenced in production notes dated February 1999, 2 weeks before the private screening. None of them exist in any version of the film available today. The Kubrick archive held at the University of the Arts London is real and partially accessible to researchers. Gaps and inconsistencies in production documentation for Eyes Wide Shut have been noted by multiple film scholars. This is not theory. This is on record. What was in scenes 44A through 44F? Why would 6 variations of the same sequence require that much coverage? Unless Kubrick was trying to capture something with absolute precision. And who decided that those 6 scenes, out of everything in a 401-day production, were the ones that could not survive? Here is what I believe was in those scenes. Not theory, not speculation. A reconstruction, built from what I saw on March 1st, what the researcher told me, and what the archive gaps confirm by their shape. The ritual sequence in the released film shows a ceremony, masked figures, a circular space, a liturgical structure borrowed from traditions most audiences wouldn't recognize. What the released version doesn't show is what happened in the room adjacent to the main hall. In the version I saw, there was a second space, smaller, less ceremonial, a room that felt less like a ritual and more like a meeting. And in that room, there were documents, shown on screen, briefly, clearly, not props designed to look official. Documents that looked like they had been placed in frame deliberately, the way Kubrick placed every single object in every single frame of every film he ever made. With intent. I couldn't read them fully in real time, but I saw enough to understand why that room, that specific shot, could not be in the final film. I want you to go back to something from part 1, the moment after the screening, when Stanley raised his hand and silenced the room. I told you I assumed, at the time, it was his usual need for control. I was wrong. He wasn't silencing the room because he wanted quiet. He was watching the executives, specifically, studying their faces in the moment after the film ended. He was checking something, measuring a reaction. That was the real final cut. Not the film, the room. He wanted to see who recognized what they had seen, before anyone had time to compose themselves. And from what I could tell, at least 2 people in that room did. Scene 44C, based on production notes and what I witnessed, ran approximately 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Wide angle, static camera, no score. A room inside the estate. 3 figures seated, unmasked. A 4th figure standing, partially visible, back to camera. On the table between them, what appeared to be a ledger, or a list. The standing figure gestures toward it once. The 3 seated figures do not react. Then the door opens. The protagonist enters, uninvited, unnoticed for exactly 6 seconds, before the scene cuts. 6 seconds of a man looking at something he was never supposed to see. That is what was removed. Not the ritual, not the ceremony, not the masks. 6 seconds of a face, and a document, and a table. In a Kubrick film, 6 seconds is an eternity. Now I want you to pause. Not figuratively. Actually, pause this video. Go back to the ritual sequence in Eyes Wide Shut. Watch the moment the camera moves toward the inner corridor, just before the protagonist is discovered. Watch it carefully. Watch the background. Then come back here and tell me, in the comments, what you see in the left side of the frame. Because I've asked a dozen people to do this, and every single one of them notices the same thing. And none of them can explain it. Kubrick once said, and I'm paraphrasing, because the original quote appeared in a private letter that has since been withdrawn from the archive, that the most dangerous thing a filmmaker can do is show an audience something real and call it fiction. Because fiction, people dismiss. But the feeling, the specific physical feeling of recognition, that stays. That is what Eyes Wide Shut was. Not a film about secret societies. Not a thriller about a marriage under pressure. A document. dressed as a dream, released to a world that wasn't ready to read it. Stanley Kubrick finished his film. He showed it to the people who needed to see it. And then, he was gone. Make of that what you will. But whatever you decide, watch the left side of the frame.